Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and welcome to Islamic Conversations. This is the first session of a new format that I'm trying out here. Notwithstanding the fact that the intro sort of clip said Islamic authors, my dear friend and colleague Jeremy Rodell is joining us as a conversation partner. He's currently the dialogue officer, and you can correct me if I'm getting some of the wording wrong here, Jeremy, at Humanists UK, previously known as the British Humanist Association. And we've had the wonderful opportunity to actually be in dialogue in the past, actually in Leicester, which is where I live. And I guess, I've got the University of Oxford tagged down here for myself, but you're also an Oxford graduate, so there's a kind of Oxford connection here. But it gives me great pleasure to welcome Jeremy. This is the first time we're actually doing something which is, on this channel, tended to be sort of academic authors and occasionally sort of broadly speaking Islamic topics. Islamic cut, and this is going to be familiar to some of our viewers, is a term that was sort of developed by a great historian, an American historian, Marshall Hodgson, to refer to aspects of Islamic culture which were kind of beyond the realm of the religious component of that. So it included things like architecture, literature, culture more generally. And so I think it's quite sort of apposite in this particular context, because we're thinking about Islam and secularism, and these are often seen oppositionally, but I think we're going to have some very interesting conversations about how that sort of picture, that dyad, can be complicated somewhat. So if it's okay with yourself, Jeremy, I'd like to invite you first to maybe speak for 5 or 10 minutes about secularism, perhaps a little bit about, your role as dialogue officer in Humanists UK, and, why that is something which we really should be thinking about in modern Britain. And then I will begin a conversation with you on that theme thereafter, if that's all right.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Usaama. I think that leads straight into me thanking you for the opportunity, because I think the more we can all understand each other, and people say, we're going to disagree, but you can disagree well. And I think both of us are capable of disagreeing well, so I'm looking forward to disagreeing well with you.
Thank you.
No, I mean, it's a really great opportunity. Perhaps I should start by saying very briefly what humanism is, because people might not know what that term is. Everyone will give you a slightly different definition. From my point of view, I suppose the main things are that as a humanist, I regard I'm a philosophically materialist, so I look for evidence, and I think sense being a way of thinking is the best way to understand objective facts about the world, and that means being willing to change your mind if new facts come along. And because of that, like most humanists, I'm an atheist. Some humanists are agnostic.
Right.
I don't call myself primarily an atheist, because I think that's just defining yourself by a negative. And you could be an axe murderer and be an atheist, and be a saint and be an atheist. It doesn't tell you very much. But most humanists are atheists for that reason, and for also that reason. I think that this is the one life we have. I believe in an afterlife. I think once I'm gone, I'll be in the same state I was before I was brought into existence. And we can talk. There's not the time now to talk about therefore where come from, but obviously they're rooted in our fellow shared humanity, and the fact that we're social animals and we live in groups. And I would say that's where all moral codes come from, because that is the source that we have. And we have to think about those, very carefully, and be willing to develop our thinking. And because there isn't any sort of great structure out there, the purpose in the universe, I don't think, is then I give myself the meaning by the stuff I do, and the people and the relationships I have, and all the other things which make life rich and meaningful. Anyway, so that's a
Right.
humanism, 101, quick nutshell thing.
Right.
So now secularism, when you propose this talk and we're exchanging email, and you called it Islam secularism, I read it, I think incorrectly, as putting the two in opposition, and straight away went back saying we're going to disagree on putting the two in opposition, because I don't think they're in opposition at all, actually.
Right. Right. Right.
And the problem with secularism is it's a term which people use in different ways and mean different things by it, and
Right.
that's just a fact of life. So all I can do is say what I mean by it and what most humanists I know mean by it,
Right.
and point out where some other meanings that people have. But so originally it was actually, as a term, was created in the 19th century by a guy called George Holyoake, and he meant by it a sort of materialist philosophy. So
Right.
I don't think he was that strong on the ethical side, but it was rather similar to what I've just described as humanism, but perhaps not quite so much on the ethics. So it was
Right.
a philosophy. That's not what people, secularists like me, mean by secularism. We're using it in a more, could call it, political sense, or a way in which society is organised sort of sense. And but you'll still find in the States, I noticed, people use secularism to mean atheism. Now, to me, it doesn't mean atheism at all, and
Sure.
that's
Sure.
why I reacted to that dichotomy.
Right. Right.
It doesn't. That would be But so, what does it mean? Well, there are sort of three broad things that fall under the heading. The first one, the one that's best known, I suppose, is this question of the separation of church and state. So it basically means that the state institutions and religious institutions are separate, and that no one set of religious institutions has special privileges. So that's
Right.
that's often what people think of as secular. The second one is that it embodies freedom of religion or belief and practice, with the only limitation really being where it starts eroding the rights and freedoms of other people. So as a secularist, and I think as a humanist, and in fact, officially as Humanists UK, very strong on freedom of religion or belief, and that means for everybody, not just people who are humanists or not religious, but for everybody. That, of course, one of the other topics we may come to also means the ability to choose your religion, which may be, or belief, which may mean that you change from the religion or belief in which you were brought up. And the final element of it is about discrimination. Is that you shouldn't be discriminated against, and particularly by the state, because of your religion or belief. Okay, so those three things are the core elements to it. And the arguments in favour of them, there was actually a paper done by a group of humanist philosophers a number of years ago now, and they said, well, really what underpins secularism are some basic ideas: personal autonomy, which is a pretty core concept, and pragmatism. You just got to get on with each other, and a sense, which we all have, hopefully, of fairness. So those three things, autonomy, fairness, and a sort of pragmatic approach, they're the sort of underlying philosophical ideas that underpin it.
Do you mind repeating those three again? I just wanted to note them down, if that's right. So,
Okay, so
personal...
they talked about autonomy,
yeah,
fairness,
yeah,
and pragmatism.
right,
Yeah.
Sure.
And now, of course, that's all very well in theory, but in practice, the world is a messy place, and there isn't anywhere. If I go back to what I define as, the key characteristics of secularism, no religious privileges in the state, and freedom of religion and belief, and no discrimination. There isn't anywhere that does that all as far as I'm aware. Maybe there is, but I'm not aware of it. And often
Right.
where we are in practice reflects the history, how people have arrived. So this is a sort of ideal which people are journeying towards, if you like, to varying degrees.
Right.
For instance, the UK is to a very secular society, but is actually, by the number one definition, falls at the first fence, because the Queen's the head of the state, and it's got the Church of England has got 6 bishops and the House of Lords. And the only other country anything like that is the Republic of Iran. So we sort of.
I mean, I think that there are a number of states in Europe which do have these kind of, what some scholars say vestigial sort of elements of religious, religion embedded within the constitution. But yeah, I mean, I think Iran is one example, but it's very, very different. Obviously, I know that you're not saying that there's any sort of
No,
it's not comparable.
Purely in terms of the bishops and the House of Lords. That's that's the comparison as an extreme.
Right.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's the only state with an elected parliament that has unelected clerics by virtue of their position. Yeah.
So just for my information, sorry, and I should know this, but I clearly don't. So there aren't other countries in Western Europe or even Eastern Europe where there are unelected clerics in an upper chamber or something like that.
No, not.
Wow. Okay.
I'm pretty sure.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a rather unique case, and
Right.
but because we're used to it, we sort of take it for granted. But this is very strange, and obviously we also have all the issue with faith schools and state-funded schools, which are religious institutions, and all of that. So we're in many ways a long way away from secularism, but in other ways we're obviously quite a secular country,
Right.
and we could talk. I've probably shut up now, but we can talk perhaps
No,
about
it's
some of the other examples around the world where, of course, there are very different models. The US, France, India, Turkey. You can see things that are claimed to be secularism, but
Right.
you can, to varying degrees. Some of them you say, yeah, that's pretty close, but some things you say, well, that's not really secularism. You can question whether Turkey was ever really secular.
Right. I mean, it sort of, I think a lot of this also hinges on sort of definitions, and then once we recognize, as you put it, the way in which religion is kind of historically embedded within a lot of ostensibly secular states, maybe we need to sort of rethink the ideal definition in light of actual practice. The real world is more messy, as it were.
Yes, though I don't think we should let go of the idea, because I think that's something which is the measuring stick, is the yardstick. So people in this country are still aspiring to be a fully secular state.
Right,
And for instance, if Scotland became an independent country, almost certainly it would be a secular state.
Right. In a sense, if they're starting from the beginning, as it were, or if they have that opportunity in the 21st century, there's no real reason to have an established church in a state like Scotland, if that eventuality realizes.
Yeah, indeed. And I suppose they probably go even further, which would be to say it would be impossible to do, because even to a lesser degree than, say, big cities in England, but Scotland is a plural, diverse society.
Right. It's very multicultural.
And that's where the pragmatic argument comes in.
Right.
Whatever you choose, somebody else is going to say, well, that's not me.
Right.
And I'm being excluded.
Yes, and I mean, basically in the UK, that's not really possible at the moment, because, and these are very fractious conversations that are taking place right now in the context of multiculturalism and all the rest of it, that if we did have the opportunity to start over at this point in time, it would look very different to how it looks right now because of the historical continuities and the place of the Church of England. I mean, disestablishment as a movement wouldn't be necessary if we were starting over, because we probably wouldn't establish, right? So, as you say, with respect to a possible Scotland, I think this is really an excellent starting point for this conversation, and I have some ideas which I think you'd find quite sort of, I think this would be an Americanism, isn't it? Left of field. I think that's an Americanism. I've lived in the US for long enough to sort of not know the difference anymore for some of these. But I look forward to sort of that opportunity for dialogue on some of those points. I think just very briefly, maybe talking a bit about Islam and how Islam fits into all of this. Viewers and audience members will know, and I should have mentioned this earlier, if you have questions, please don't hesitate to ask. We will try and address them around the hour. So people are more than welcome to ask questions to either Jeremy, who's the guest for this week, or myself, so that we can be in conversation with each other. And I'd also encourage people to sort of subscribe for future opportunities to participate in these sorts of conversations as well. So just Islam, in a sense, like any tradition, will have contested sort of understandings of what it stands for. But I think on a minimal level, the Quran is basically the founding document, and the Prophet is the sort of a person who comes as the conveyor of that message. He's not himself divine, but he has a kind of sanctity about him. Muslims tend to believe that he is, the most perfect human that ever lived, and those sorts of things. The Quran is, on the other hand, believed to be, in quite a literal sense, the word of God, which doesn't mean it has to be literally understood, of course, but in a very different sense to the way in which the Old Testament or the New Testament are recognizably sort of composite works that have been compiled by multiple people over centuries in some cases. The Quran actually is a text which came about and came together at a very specific point in sort of history, and there's not a huge amount of debate about authorship and things like that. Obviously, if you're a believer, it's from God. If you're an unbeliever, it'll be the Prophet Muhammad as the actual author or something along those lines. So once you have that sort of raw material, the question is, okay, how does that affect the way in which we understand what we're supposed to do from a Muslim perspective? And this, for an atheist, of course, this would be something which is would seem superstitious, but obviously, because we all live together in our own societies, we respect each other's perspectives. So from a Muslim's perspective, the atheist sort of metaphysic, which is to say kind of absence of metaphysics, is also sort of preposterous, so to speak. But from a Muslim's perspective, believing that God has actually spoken to a human being to, in a sense, give guidance and direction at how humanity, or those who accept, on a minimal level, those who accept the prophets, having received revelation, that creates a kind of obligation, right? That, especially in a place like modern Britain, actually, I think creates certain types of tensions which are really interesting worthy of exploration, I think. And that's what I look forward to having our conversation about. I just wanted to say minimally, basically, a Muslim is someone who accepts that there is no God but God, and Muhammad is the messenger of God. And that's basically the testament of faith. And that's really simple, but at the same time, so much flows from it on the basis of those texts and those sort of sources of tradition that I referred to, that there's a lot of interesting dynamics at play. And of course, in the modern period, Muslims make up nearly 2 billion, about a quarter of humanity, 2 billion people on the planet. For better or for worse, we never seem to be out of the news, right? So, I look forward to a broader series of conversations. But if it's all right with yourself, Jeremy, I'm going to launch into some questions.
Yeah, go for it.
And in a sense, my starting question is a bit left of field. So I actually am in the process of, you know, writing kind of a short book, and then hopefully I'm going to write a longer book on this sort of topic, which basically argues that the way in which we define religion is kind of privileges it's a particular understanding that developed at a certain point in time in European history. And because we've defined religion in that way as being something which is essentially a private matter, which stays out of, and that the public realm is, in a sense, it's implied that it should be secular. You know, that creates a certain type of normative context. Whereas from the Islamic perspective, there's also actually a self-conception of religion. The term in the Quran is deen. You may well have come across this word because Muslims use it a lot. And when it comes, the term deen, my sort of contention is that secularism actually can be seen as functioning more or less as a deen. And so, in a very ironic sense, secularism from a Muslim perspective is a religion that claims that other religions must be kept out of the political sphere, but it's only possible because of a kind of sleight of hand that is a product of European history in the post-Enlightenment context, which defines religion in a way that leaves secularism unscathed. Right? I wonder what you think of that. It's obviously a very sort of...
Well, it's not a new criticism of secularism. Right. We haven't talked about different sorts of secularism, and
right.
And one of the particular differences among the sorts of secularism is what's called, I think it was, I can't remember who it was originally, but the difference between open and closed secularism, or
right.
Rowan Williams said programmatic and procedural. And really what that's about is the extent to which you do, the French version, which is the real exclusion of religion from the public sphere altogether. It's to a very large extent. Okay. Even in France, not perfectly, because any church built before 1905 is actually paid for by the government, and so are all the priests, but that's historical accident. Right. That's pretty extreme, and then you get all the consequences of that, which we see reflected in old and the recent legislation, about religious symbols, and it's particularly in Muslims, of course, because of greater visibility. And I personally, I find that very difficult. I don't think that's very, helpful way of building society. The
laïcité model,
yes,
of basically suppressing, in a sense, religious.
Yes, yes. Yeah. And you can understand where they're coming from with laïcité, because where it came from was in the French tradition, really, because the Ancien Régime was a combination of the monarchy and the Catholic Church together. They were the top dogs, and so this is all about overthrowing it wasn't a theocracy, but it was a monarchical theocracy, if you like, whatever word you want to use. And
sure.
And that thinking there's been various changes since, but that's still reflected in the way that this is thought of and defended in France. This is what we really have to defend. And it leads to daft things like, you remember there was the attempt to ban bikinis on the beach a few years ago, cover up things, and fortunately there was a court case against the mayor, and he lost. They won. But anyway, but there's all sorts of things which to us you think that's just weird. Why would you want to impose that on someone? But so we think it's weird because in general in this country we've promoted a more open secularism, which basically
Right.
says it's fine. You can be, you can do whatever you want. You can be a public figure. You can be the Archbishop of Canterbury and appear on the telly. But
Right.
what the only thing is, you don't have a privileged position as
Right.
by virtue of your so.
Religious station.
And that's an important distinction. And there are quite a lot of people in public life and in political life who have strong religious convictions, and people know that, and that's
Right.
part of what you vote for when you vote for them. So
Right. Right.
I think that's a very important distinction. So I'm not sure I share exactly what you're saying about the suppression. And when I think of what religion is, because I think the idea of secularism, I say, is quite a sort of modern idea in a way.
Yeah.
I mean, when you look at religions, I think I like the William James sort of definition, which is any definition you come up with has to work for everything, including Buddhism. Buddhism is tricky because it's a non-theistic
Right.
religion,
Right. Right.
and
Right.
and
Even atheistic, according to some, right?
yes, indeed. Yes.
Yes.
Well,
Yes.
yes, non-theist. Yes, the same difference. So,
Right.
and he said that the core of it is a belief in an unseen order and living your life accordingly. And that seems to me because it does cover virtually all types of religion. That you believe there's an unseen order, as most Buddhists, perhaps not all Western Buddhists, but most Buddhists do.
Right.
And people do tend to try to live their lives on the basis of that unseen order, okay, which includes
Right.
for many people reincarnation and all of that. So, yeah,
But yeah, I mean, this is where. So I if it's all right, I'll sort of like.
yeah, go. Mm.
Thank you. So yeah, I think I mean the French example is obviously a particularly extreme example for those of us who live in the sort of Anglosphere. It just seems a bit bizarre. Although again, I mean, I think it reflects the cultural contingencies of what we consider to be acceptable norms. I mean, the French passionately defend it and say
Yeah,
that
they
it's
do.
this is the only acceptable way in which, and you guys are kind of like not true secularists in a sense, but at the same time, we have. I mean, my contention, of course, is to say, no, even in a place like Britain, even in a place like the United States, we have what is effectively, in my, by my lights, a kind of a secular religion of sorts. And the reason I say that, I'm just trying to think about the example that you just mentioned. After the French example, we were talking about just a moment ago. Sorry, something came up on my screen and it distracted me.
Sorry.
Um,
Well,
so
about William
after
James,
the okay, yes. So William
and
James,
what a religion is. Yeah,
precisely. So the definition of religion is notoriously sort of difficult to pinpoint, and
yes,
in my estimation, I mean, basically, by picking a definition, you can try and sort of work out a system. But even in William James's kind of like, there's an unseen system, or there's this unseen sort of, I forget the exact phrase that he used.
it's sort of an
that you
unseen
mentioned.
order. He talks
An
about
unseen order.
belief in an unseen order. Yeah, yes,
I mean, in my estimation, sort of the sort of the post-enlightenment commitments that arise are also a kind of unseen order, right? I mean, these commitments to human rationality, to humanism, to what has eventually emerged as democracy, to conceptions like human rights and various values that we all actually think are extremely important, even if there are certain disagreements on specific instantiations. And these are ultimately unseen, right? They are, they're not transcendent in the sense that people believe in a world of ideas, right? I mean, whether Plato actually literally believed in a world of ideas is a whole area of debate. He's just talking conceptually as well, right?
yeah.
According to a lot of philosophers. And so, by my lights, why is that significantly different from, believing in another realm in which, okay, there's actually a belief in heaven and hell. In my estimation, these are still all beliefs beyond the realm of the empirical sort of world. And these are things that we need to develop whether we believe they actually exist or whether we believe that they are really socially constructed and only exist in our minds, they are still these ideals that we adhere to. And so, I mean, these are, as you say, very old objections, but I'm very interested to hear sort of what makes, religion different from secularism, basically.
Well, I think
Yeah.
there is, I mean, obviously ideas are, you can't pin down an idea. And I'm not
Right.
I don't believe in scientism, which says that, everything, unless you can nail it to the floor, it doesn't exist. That's
Right. Right.
manifestly untrue.
Right. Right.
You wouldn't have any human emotions at all if you followed that. As subjective, the things that are most important to us
Right.
are not in that category. But
Right.
we
Right.
know all those things are, but we know all those things are ideas and experiences and feelings and things which we can communicate to people. Nobody's questioning, when I say, I've just hit my finger with a hammer, nobody questions when I say it hurts. They take my
Right.
word for it, and
Right.
it's a real thing.
Yeah.
Whereas I think the unseen order, what he was talking about, was
Yeah.
something objective that
Yeah.
exists out there.
Right.
And I think that is a qualitatively different thing, and these are eternal truths that people have a belief in, and which are very, very important to people, of course.
Hmm. I mean, yeah, I think, to my mind, it just seems a kind of special pleading. Forgive me if I'm being
No,
sort of just.
yeah, please
I,
do.
I mean, in the sense that when we think about values like democracy, particularly values like human rights,
Mm.
um, you know, just as the values of attaining nirvana in the Buddhist tradition are not really realizable unless you're a human being that's living in sort of necessarily as part of a society, because you can't come about as a human being unless you're a part of a society. In similar ways, like no one's saying nirvana is going to be something important when humans at some point in the future kind of no longer continue to exist, for example. And I think that the same kind of idea would apply to values like human rights in the secular tradition. I think what's interesting about the secular tradition is a kind of like, okay, we're suspending, either we're rejecting or absolutely suspending judgment about sort of the existence of a metaphysical realm in which we will continue in an afterlife, or something along those lines. That's fine. I don't think that makes it significantly different from sort of. I don't think a separate category is deserved under those circumstances, if that makes sense.
Right. I
Yeah.
mean, it feels to me like they're totally different because, I mean, I agree with you. A key point, obviously, sort of, we are slipping a little bit between secularism and and discussions about the principles of humanism and atheism, but versus
Right.
religion, which is another rather an argument that's been going for at least 3,000 years. So we probably won't crack it.
Right. Right.
I would say that everything is a human construction. All of these ideas,
Right.
so all
Right.
morality, all human rights, all religion, of course, from my point of view, are human
Right.
creation
Right.
because that's all there is.
Right.
So yes, so that's so, and we and humans have ideas, and some of them work to make lives happier in our societies than others do. And
So that would suggest, that they're all sort of the same on some sense. Yes.
I see what you're saying. I think it is
Yeah.
the belief then that one of those ideas is that there is something objective out there, whether it's a supernatural realm. I use that term not in a sort of pejorative sense, by the way, but
Yes, of
in
course.
a literal sense.
Yeah.
Whether we mean it's a supernatural realm or realms, or whether we just think it's a supernatural order, like the Buddhist one, which is that life is suffering and this is your route out
Right.
off the wheel of, and Hindus has a similar view
Right.
of eternal cycle of death and rebirth.
Yeah.
That's just saying this is the way the world is set up, and that karma, actions have consequences, and you will get the pluses or minuses from those in this life or another. That's a belief about the structure of the world, just as a Muslim would have a belief that there is a God, there is a heaven and a hell, and those are real places. But they're both cases, they're exclusive. They're beliefs in an unseen order. That's why the order bit is actually quite a clever term, because it manages to cover both of those things. Now, I don't think that secularism.
So order here means a realm, in a sense.
Or a thing, yes, is just a structure or a thing, yes. Whereas secularism is indeed just a set of human ideas, same as how to behave in a good way is a human idea, but it's a set of it's a human idea which seems to be a good thing. If you apply those tests to it, it means that people want to be themselves, so you have personal autonomy, and it means we have an innate sense of fairness. It's the first thing that children develop at a very very early age. There have been recent tests on that. Before speech, sense of fairness is there, and particularly in the context that we're talking, the context of a plural society, it's pragmatically a good thing because it enables people to get along even though they're different. So it's a set of ideas. It's human creation. It's not an unseen order at all, but it's just a set of ideas which can work, particularly in a plural society, but in any society where people are free to have personal autonomy.
So this is, it's really interesting because, in essence, what I would suggest here is that, in a sense, that point of distinction is important to secularism's self-justification, right? We're different from the rest on this point. And to my mind, kind of looking at the history of the way in which humans have justified their sort of normative systems. And for me, actually, religion is kind of, the definition of religion is a normative system, basically. And then suddenly everything's a religion. But the way in which humans have defined that, usually the sort of new sort of kid on the block comes and says, well, you all had this in the past, and we're better than all of you because of this, and you don't have this, right? Or you're different from us in this way. And in my estimation, basically, that distinction between, what William James is trying and various other people have tried, for example, to hinge it to a belief in God or the transcendent or something along those lines. And it still continues as a kind of a struggle within the self-justification of religious studies as a field, actually, in the academy today. To my mind, that's only possible in this context where, for significant numbers of people, this is an important distinction to make. Whereas in another context, like the Islamic context, where the Quran says, you have your religion, I have mine. And that was addressing people who didn't believe in an afterlife, right? They thought, when we're finished, time destroys us and then there's nothing after that. Mm-hmm. But the Quran literally calls that a religion. Lakum dinukum waliya din. You have your religion, I have mine. The Prophet is addressing them. And so that distinction just isn't salient in the Islamic conception of what a deen is. And so, suddenly we're in a situation where, okay, this justifies the normative structure that we have in the West, but can we really apply, does that potentially problematize the category of secularism as an idea? Yeah. And are there potentially in every tradition, I would contend within the Islamic tradition there definitely is, ways of dealing with pluralism which are their own indigenous sort of traditions of pluralism, which might seem to be sort of have all sorts of problems from a secular perspective, but from an Islamic perspective, secularism has all of these problems that might not even come up or occur to those looking through a secular lens. This is the problem of relativism as well, to a certain extent.
But it's interesting when you ask, surveys done about British Muslims, British Muslims feel extremely free to practice their faith, and so, but yeah, I mean, I think one of the part of the problem with the terminology is there's all sorts of other emotional baggage that comes with it. If you go to the Middle East, the secularism is associated with dictatorship, and um, and
yeah, it's very problematic there.
and which, of course, by the definition I've given, that isn't secularism, but that term was used, and it's also seen because it's come up during the 19th century, and maybe is seen as arising from European thought. Then, of course,
Right.
for some people, it presses the colonial button, and this is an imposed Western idea on other people.
Right.
And I think
Although
those sort of accumulates, they're contaminants, if you like. to the
But in
idea.
a sense, I think, I mean, part of my contention here is that, you can say that it can be portrayed as a Eurocentric sort of idea, and that makes it look bad. My contention, of course, as a kind of intellectual historian, as it were, of the Islamic tradition, but also the European tradition, is that it is, in fact, a product of a European tradition of thought that went global because of European dominance around the globe. But I can entirely understand the challenges and the problems that arise from accepting a pure relativism, an anxiety which is very strongly felt, I think, in certain sections of Europe. But I think that the sort of relativism versus kind of acceptance of positivism kind of in an unreconstructed fashion isn't the only option. There are all sorts of other options, and from the Muslim perspective, for example.
Can you say a bit more about what you see would be a sort of Muslim version, if you like, a Muslim, from a Muslim point of view?
Yeah, I think this is. I mean, this is one of the issues which I really want to spend a lot more time researching. At the moment, I'm really doing sort of rudimentary sort of first steps in this research, and I'm looking at how sort of modern scholars in the Middle East look at some of these questions. But essentially, a lot of the way in which we think about what is acceptable and how pluralism works is so colored by our conception of a secular global order that when you bring up sort of a religious version of this, it grates, it feels in a sense completely unacceptable from the get-go. And I think there's a lot of unlearning that needs to take place to start to make this stuff seem worthy of even discussion. So one of the things that I think about sometimes is the status of al-Azami, which is a term you'll well know about sort of the medieval Islamic tradition. If you were a non-Muslim living in the Muslim world, you would pay a tax, the dhimma or the dhimmi tax, so to speak, what's called the jizya, and you would be afforded protection and the right to live in those sorts of societies. Now, for me, it's and I've actually done a bit of research, and I've written a sort of like short paper on how this was practiced in the medieval era. Not practiced, but how the legal theory sort of looked. And some of the legal theory doesn't make for comfortable reading. It basically says you have to make sure that they feel like they know their place in society. They are subordinate, right?
Yeah.
And not all of it, but that's a pretty salient feature, I think, of a lot of legal traditions. Now, I also have studied how a lot of modern scholars are saying, well, that component of this is no longer necessary. Is not really something which is called for by the scriptural sources. So they're saying that the medieval era had a way about dealing with this, but we don't actually agree with it. That's not reflective of the actual scriptural sources. So that's great, but what I want to do in that particular instance is kind of invert the question: what is the Ahl al-Dhimma, and what is its equivalent in a secular context? Basically, if you think about nationalism as an idea, and the fact that we are citizens of these states, we have insiders and outsiders. We create insiders and outsiders because of the way in which we've organized the world today. And there are some scholars who've talked about nationalism as a kind of religion, including in sort of like moderate contexts. We're not just talking about sort of Weimar Republic or something like that.
Yeah.
And so, I just reflect on the fact that my wife, she's hopefully soon going to become a citizen of this country. It's taken about 5 years through marriage. And we've spent thousands of pounds to try to justify her ability to stay in this country, visas and these sorts of things. If you look at the way in which the dhimmi tax, the levels of what was expected to be levied, it was a lot more affordable, so to speak. And this is one of those areas where I'm basically suggesting that obviously immigration is a very touchy subject in the UK and Brexit Britain. But we're still human beings. We still create those sorts of realities in our social life that we found problematic in the Middle Ages and associated with religion, right? And in my estimation, the dhimma as a model, how it was expressed in the medieval era, I don't actually like personally, and I strongly sort of like feel supportive of the scholars who have, in a sense, reinterpreted that tradition to make it something far more humane, where actually the cost of it is minimal as well, and potentially is something that can be completely dropped and it can be renamed and all of that stuff, and all of the negativity associated with it that needn't be there. But that basically allows you to live as a citizen in a Muslim sort of majority polity.
Yeah.
I think that the fundamental problem there, of course, would be from a secular perspective. It's like, well, as long as you define your polity in religious terms, you have a problem. And that, is a far more fundamental challenge for the Muslim tradition or for the Islamic tradition, because it's so deeply embedded, in my estimation.
Yeah.
I hope that
Islam is fairly unique among the world faiths because its founder, leader, had so many
success
hats that he was wearing.
Yes.
So he was a religious. So he was a religious leader, but he was a military and political leader. So that that those are peculiar. There probably are other cases, but none of them come to mind. So that's.
But in my redefinition of secularism, right? Yeah. I mean, if you indulge me for just a second, in my redefinition of secularism, it's like, well, actually, secularism as a religion wears a political hat, wears a military hat, and wears what I'm calling a religious hat, but what would usually be called an ideology in a non-pejorative sense, in the set of ideas that we use to organize society and create legal norms and all of this sort of stuff. So I don't think it's particularly unique, but yeah. But I'm kind of putting front and center an Islamic conception of religion.
Secularism is a form of religion.
But it'd be interesting to see why not.
Well, I can say that if you say that that religions are just sets of ideas, then indeed it is also a set of ideas about how you organise society. But I think most religious people say that religion is a lot more than just a set of ideas, and they're talking about actual, real truths, objective truths. And nobody's saying that about.
But I think secular people do that as well. I mean, I think that a lot of people in the secular world are committed to the objective reality of human rights, committed to the objective reality of these sorts of values that we should, we recognize the contingency of them and the fact that they are dependent on the existence of human beings as societies, but democracy, human rights, secular law, all of these sorts of things, I think, are objective reality.
I suppose the question, though, then is going back to what you said. You're talking about the dhimmi rules. Then that's obviously how it was done in the past, and Jews and Christians in particular, the most, because you're right that citizenship, that issue arises now because we have a lot of geographical movement, and we've defined our nation states on the basis of geography. And so we have, citizenship is sort of hardwired in, if you like. But when you go to the model, the medieval model, where
Right.
the scholars moved, but basically people, there were countries and places, and wasn't mass migration or anything like that.
Right.
Or was very little.
There probably were occasions. I
Yeah,
mean,
there were
I think
occasions.
humans have always moved, but it wouldn't be on the scale that's possible
Not on the
today.
scale that.
Yes.
No, and there were far fewer
Yes.
people, of course. But the thing about it is, it presupposes that you have Islam is sort of running the show, and as you
Right.
said, you've got these people who are, were originally in medieval times second-class citizens, and paid, as long as they paid their
Right.
money, they were going to be all right. Um,
Right.
and so, and I think there were some other rules around it as well. I'm not sure whether they served in the armed forces. And
Yeah, I mean, some of it's like
some
sartorial
did.
rules and
Yeah,
other things.
yeah, yeah. Which
Yeah.
were, obviously you say that to a Jewish person, and
Discriminatory.
the press is, I'm wearing a yellow star. That's not a
Of
good
course,
thing.
yeah.
Um,
Yes.
so, but the problem with it is, it doesn't work in a society where you have autonomy. I mean, what happens when, like in this country, say we'd applied that principle to Anglicanism.
Right.
Now, if you apply that principle to Anglicanism in the 1850s, the
Yeah.
church going wasn't as big as people like to think it was. You might say that 80-90% of the population would have identified themselves as Anglicans. Okay,
Right.
so then you say,
Right.
right, we're going to have the same concept, and we have a dimmy thing for the Catholics and the Jews, who are the only other ones.
Yeah.
But of course, then you wind forward to now.
Yeah.
And there are 17...
I don't think that I don't think that should be applied in our context from a Muslim perspective. But what I would contend is actually we do have that from a secular perspective, right? I mean, it's just instantiated, and basically we call it citizenship right now. And you have citizens.
Yeah, yeah, but I was just trying to pin
Sorry.
down the idea that if you applied the thinking,
Yeah.
but just applied it to Anglicanism instead of to Islam, and you applied it to this country, we'd now be in a position where 78% of the population were dhimmi.
Right. Right.
Okay,
Right,
so
right.
now what happens?
Yes, I mean, I think that's precisely the problem that a lot of modern scholars have been trying to contend with. And basically, I've studied this as an intellectual historian, not as a normative sort of political theorist or a theologian yet, but I hope to at some point. So these are kind of reflections which are half-baked at this point.
Yeah.
But what they seem to be doing, what these modern scholars seem to be doing, is basically saying, look, we accept citizenship as a principle that is universal. And citizenship in a Muslim context should afford almost complete rights for complete equal rights for a non-Muslim as a Muslim. Okay, so no sartorial discrimination, not even payment of jizya, because they're basically saying, look, the jizya was, some of the legal arguments historically were that jizya was paid because there was no obligation for non-Muslims to serve in the army. The army was confessional itself. And so since now we have standing armies and the average person doesn't go into the army anyway, there isn't a conscription system in most Muslim countries, that rule doesn't need to apply anymore. And so they should just pay regular taxes like everyone else. And that's all their obligations are. And the other thing that they add, which I think would possibly be uncomfortable for some secular sort of readers, is that they'll say, some scholars say things like non-Muslims should be aware of not, bearing in mind the sentiments of the Muslim majority, not doing things which are going to provoke them in needless ways, etc., etc. And they make that explicit. What I would say is, in a context like Britain, Muslims live that reality, right? Because of things like Prevent, because of the way in which, and we've had a bit of a conversation about Prevent in the past, but in the way in which there's a kind of potential sort of concern about, Muslims, if they're talking about the political, or if they're talking about these sorts of things, particularly on the sort of right-wing media space, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, I think that you don't necessarily need to explicitly articulate it, but Muslims very often know that there are certain limits that you can't cross without serious repercussions for your sort of like participation in the public realm.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So
I
I think it manifests in other ways.
Yes,
Yeah.
I think what you're talking about there is prejudice, anti-Muslim bigotry, and which is obviously,
Yeah.
and
And we think of who's the prime minister, right? Right.
yeah, well,
I
yeah,
mean, like,
that's another avenue you could spend some time. Well, actually, probably not much time.
yes.
We probably, but
Right.
but I
Right.
think
Sure.
those are separate issues because no society is going to be perfect,
Right.
and
Absolutely.
and there's
Absolutely.
always going to be prejudice. There's always going to, if we had somebody from the Roma community here, they would be very strong and say, "You call that prejudice? You should see it," and
Absolutely.
so
Absolutely. Yeah.
uh, so I think those are almost sort of they're important issues, but I don't see them
Yeah.
as I think most, and certainly in terms of the legal structure, and I mean basically we're by most international standards, a fairly tolerant country, and actually the data shows we've got slightly more tolerant actually. If you ask people the acid test question, which is about
Yeah.
relatives marrying somebody from a different background, what
Yeah.
people think.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because
I'd be interested to see specifically the Muslim question there, because it's interesting because Muslims have not tracked that greater tolerance that's spread in
you're
society.
probably right.
Yeah.
So towards Muslims,
Unfortunately.
and
Yeah.
obviously there's all sorts of reasons for that. So,
Yeah.
some of which we know.
But
And that's,
but even those reasons are really interesting and worthy of study, because the choice I don't know if you've come across this phrase securitization,
yes,
kind of international relations term.
yeah,
And so the choice to look at Muslims a particular way because of the activities of this tiny minority who don't really represent the vast majority of Muslims is a very specific choice that has been made by us as a society, by our political classes, that which is just a reflection, in my estimation, of a kind of prejudice of those sorts of problems.
I see.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I agree with that, but I think
Oh,
it's a
interesting.
separate discussion. I
Yes,
think that's
it's a very lengthy one as well.
Yeah. But coming back to the Jimmy thing, I think underneath that is the view, underneath the idea is that you may think, take the example I gave of the Anglicanism, and now it would be 78% Dhimmi. You may have been thinking that wouldn't have happened because Islam would have just kept to the 90%. And
Right.
one of the reasons it keeps to that is because it's very hard. The free thought is not encouraged. That it's difficult to leave, and so
That's actually quite I wouldn't agree with that at all. But anyway, we'll let's potentially discuss this.
Who were Muslims who would very strongly agree with that, who've had very
We can discuss
Yeah,
again.
yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So, but apostasy is formally is a problematic issue,
Right.
and it's not only in Islam, of course.
Right.
In others as well. So
Yeah.
So when you say, well, okay, you've got so we've got this Anglican society and there's 78% Dhimmi, and how are the laws made?
Right.
How does the law get made? And
Right. So in that sort of context, sorry, go ahead. You can
go on. That's the question.
So these the modern scholars who are kind of like in a sense they're going back to first principles with the scriptural texts and so on, and because the world has changed so dramatically, they're basically saying, okay, what can we do? How do we remain faithful to the Islamic tradition in such radically different circumstances? There's no caliphate, there's no normative order from the medieval era, and so they would say that actually you just have parliamentary democracy. And most of the laws, so you just basically have a recognition that laws should not contravene Islamic norms, and that's obviously something which is going to be hashed out in debate. What do Islamic norms mean? That would go through sort of a parliamentary process to actually establish. That it doesn't necessarily mean that the people who are in the parliament are going to be clerics. Just one example that I give often is that just as MPs are not sort of constitutional lawyers, right? Obama being a very unusual example of a constitutional lawyer who's also head of state. Yeah. So that's how the laws would be figured out, through that sort of process.
Obviously, in the current context, things like
Yeah.
Islamic norms is a very
Yeah.
contentious issue, isn't it? I mean, it's
Okay,
rather
so
like
we'd have to go sort of piece by piece.
like the Taliban saying, it's all okay as long as we follow the Sharia, and then
So
somebody
yeah,
says,
yeah.
well,
So this is
what do you mean by that? And of course, what
right,
they mean by it
right.
can be, they haven't actually, interestingly, as I discovered this morning,
Yeah,
the Constitution of Afghanistan from
yeah,
2004 had
yeah,
that clause in it anyway.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And
And
most Muslim countries have it.
well, not most of them do. Yeah.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
what may happen is, because of course you could drive a bus through the definition of it, presumably,
yeah,
and
yeah.
and
And most
so
Muslim countries do.
yes, they do. But I think when you have 78% of the members of parliament, you say, wait a minute, why have we got to follow Islamic laws? Only 10% of the population are Islamic, so we
Right,
change
right,
that. So
right.
it's not sustainable. Whereas if
No,
you
I mean,
say,
I don't think that that's necessarily the case. Again, you know, the sort of Islamic legal thought in the medieval era did not countenance the application of Islamic law to non-Muslims, right? It
right,
just didn't. I mean,
no,
that was just normal, because in the medieval era, laws were confessional and worked within
yeah,
confessional communities.
yes, and
And
that's yes,
so, yeah, so I mean, I think what's interesting in the modern world is this kind of assumption that rule of law is one-dimensional, at least in sort of Western countries. What's interesting is in various colonial countries, you often had multiple jurisdictions working
mm,
within one,
yeah,
polity.
yeah,
And yeah, there's some very interesting work done on this, which I'm not very well read on. Like Jessica Margolin did something on Jewish family court issues ending up in Islamic courts in Morocco in the 18th
mm,
century.
mm,
And so there was what's called forum shopping, going from one sort of
yeah,
jurisdiction to
yeah,
another to look for what was the most favorable outcome for the sort of couple, for
yeah.
example.
I mean, that idea is it is a people, countries that were regarded as secular. That idea
Right,
is called pillarization. You have a pillar
right,
which is,
right.
and so
So
like in
the Dutch have
Holland,
that.
had that,
Right, right,
yeah.
right, right,
And
right, right.
I think most people, now it's broken down now, but
Okay.
it would, I think, be regarded as being, it's quite difficult to do that, particularly when you apply it to issues like, when it clashes with human rights, and a woman who,
Right.
and you might say, well, yeah, but human rights are a Western construct, but that's another argument.
No, no, no.
But,
I'm not.
but
I wouldn't suggest that. I would just say that the conception of human rights that prevails is sort of Eurocentric. Certainly,
yeah,
the Islamic tradition has its own conception of human rights, right?
yeah, yeah,
But yeah,
yeah, and there's some overlap between those,
and there's
but
considerable overlap, right?
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. But I mean,
yeah,
we all know where the pinch points are on that issue.
and yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
and
So
and
you
I think
have.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say. I mean, so the idea that you have different laws for different people
Right,
presupposes that therefore that can, in a plural society, can generate a lot of perceived injustice and unfairness, because you can have somebody who's in all other respects, because we're all multi-dimensional people and we all have multiple
right,
identities, and you can have
right,
somebody who is almost identical in all respects other than this one, and then they find they have
right,
different laws applied to them, and that would
right.
generate a strong sense of injustice in a plural society, and a
I think
well-informed
in
plural society.
practice. I think in practice it's probably been quite complicated, because it's probably my impression certainly is that it's the case that people often had the choice to choose between different fora. But yes, I think there is the potential that perhaps somewhat disempowered groups, women for example,
Mm.
might be compelled to work within or operate within sort of certain jurisdictional limits.
Yeah.
Um, But at the same time, it's complicated because there's questions of conscience that arise. There are plenty of women, for example, in the Jewish community in a place like New York, who will be kind of left hanging in sort of limbo with respect to their divorces because their husbands haven't pronounced the get.
Yeah.
The equivalent can happen in the Islamic tradition.
Yeah.
But she is not, in good conscience, cannot remarry until she gets that from her husband.
Yeah.
And that's a sort of religious
Yes,
sort
that's
of
a religious
pathway that,
Yeah.
and so we can try and institute a kind of uniform code, but until we convert all of these people into the secular sort of like
that applies in a secular society. So there's nothing, to stop in a secular, because if you believe in freedom of religion, then that woman is free to choose to follow a certain religious
But what
code.
if she doesn't? But what if she doesn't? That's what happens in New York in particular, for example, very a sizable Orthodox community.
Yeah.
And women do not feel they can, in good conscience, leave their. I mean, there are all sorts of other costs as well, sociologically speaking, because if she doesn't do that, there are all sorts of other problems. But it's usually, I'd say, a question of conscience for the person in question.
Yes.
Yeah. So
Yes, and that's fine. That's fine, and that's because I mean it is problematic for those of us who believe in freedom of religion and belief. That how far do you go in respecting that when you can see that it is creating problems for individuals? Like a particular one. We've got an organisation under the wing of Humanists UK called Faith to Faithless. Okay, and it's it supports people, and it was actually founded by 2 ex-Muslims, but a lot of the people that they work with are not ex-Muslims. They're people who were Jehovah's Witnesses or ultra-Orthodox Jews, and they all have the same problem, and there are even cases where somebody who's lived in London, and the guy didn't know how to even navigate, going to see the GP. He didn't know. He lived his whole life in London, but because he has a community which is an ultra-Orthodox, an isolationist form of Judaism. Now, is that
they don't have TVs and so on? Yeah.
Is that an abuse? Is that at what point do you say, wait a minute, that's the rights of the child are coming in there? He should have had the education that enables him to be able to do that and to make that choice. And that's where you get. This is where
it's really these are very thorny questions. These are very thorny. So I have a colleague who, and I mean, I suspect in this particular instance, what would happen is the government would probably interface with something like the Board of Deputies to sort of think about, okay, what's the best way to, and maybe there's ongoing dialogue. And because the Jews in this country are not a securitized community, it's not something where the heavy hand of the state is being imposed in the way that Muslims routinely get talked about with analogous issues potentially in certain communities. But we're on the news regularly. I mean, one of the things that came to mind when you just mentioned that, and it slipped my mind, so maybe I'll come back to it if that's all right. I did want to just acknowledge one question and a few comments. So if it's all right, I'm going to just put the comments on very briefly. Actually, one of them is just someone telling me to invite a certain person to the podcast. So I look forward to potentially inviting Mohammed Hijab to this podcast at some point in the future. Someone, I've bumped into him once, but I've not really had a proper chat. Android App 10 says Montesquieu argued that legal pluralism is more than just legal monism. This kind of goes back to one of our earlier discussions that it's a complicated debate. I'm not qualified to discuss Montesquieu at this stage, and I hope to read him at some point in the future. The question is probably, very interesting. So this is for you. It's been asked quite a while ago now. I hope Yusuf Ali is still with us.
Yes, now that's an interesting...
So if it's all right, I'm going to just read it out for potentially... We usually replay this on a podcast. So a question for Jeremy towards the end. Do humanists have privilege over other sentient beings?
I think he means, do humanists privilege humans over other sentient beings?
Okay, humans
over beings.
If so... Yeah, and if so, then what naturalistic grounds should we, on what naturalistic grounds should we do so? Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
This is an interesting thing because this is like a lot of issues. This is where you'll find differing views among humanists.
Right.
And so I think most humanists would say we should, we should respect the suffering and the well-being of other
Right.
sentient animals. Yes.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
And that's why I think if you take any group of humanists, you would find a higher proportion of vegetarians and vegans among them than you would among the general population. Right. And right. Among the people who are not vegetarians and vegans, you'd find a high proportion of people who take care about, if they do eat meat, where it comes from, and the good quality animal husbandry and so on.
Right.
So
right.
That is a significant thing among humanists, and it's something that's debated quite a lot. So if the answer is that okay, humanism has the word human in it, but does concern for well-being and suffering is limited to humans, the answer is no.
Right. Okay. And I think there's a lot of there's a broad range of discussion in these sorts of areas, but sentience seems to be one of those very important dimensions which I've come across in the work of people like Peter Singer and so on.
Yes, he takes a very hard line, but he takes
extreme
quite hard lines on a number of things. Yeah.
Yes. Hard line. He's a bit controversial. He's at Princeton. I sort of bumped into him once there, but haven't really. I didn't attend his classes or anything. Just bumped into him in another event once. I wanted to sort of. Perhaps in the next few minutes we'll sort of begin to wrap up, if that's all right. But I wanted to just look at one point that you mentioned, which is apostasy. Mm-hmm. And, this is another of those areas where a lot of modern scholars have basically said, well, actually, this is not something that applies for people's personal private beliefs, etc., if they want to switch religions, etc. It's obviously something which Muslim scholars consider them to be sort of engaged in something which is the greatest sin, which is to leave sort of faith. But that's not something which has a worldly punishment. So this is very interesting for me. I'd like to study it potentially in the future, because the transition from the medieval era to the modern era in this particular question seems to be quite radical. I'm not aware of there being difference of opinion on apostasy sort of deserving the death penalty in theory. In practice, it's a very different sort of proposition, and there's good scholarship on this now. And so, some of the scholars actually point out that this was a moral claim being made very often in these sorts of laws, which are very harsh in the medieval tradition, because most of the time the states aren't sort of like significant enough or large enough or powerful enough to really enact these in most cases, the vast majority of cases. Now, I wonder what you think of this, which is, like, we can talk about the theory and the sort of, the legal argumentation, the philosophical case that's being made, but we can also look at the practice. And in practice, I think that you can find analogues to religious positions in the secular order as well. So for me, the analogue for apostasy is the accusation of being a terrorist and the consequences that follow from that. Mm-hmm. And so, the drone warfare that has been sort of conducted by the United States has, over the last few years, recently there was a controversy about this, but something like 80 to 90% of the victims are collateral damage. But they were written off as terrorist deaths. And because the bar is so low for measuring them as such. And another sort of dimension of this is the way in which we respond to sort of migrant flows and the migration crisis, as it's been called in Europe over the last few sort of years, since 2011 basically, or actually since the wars on Iraq and so on. And these are really, these have been very challenging issues for liberal Europe, of course. But it's minuscule in terms of the numbers of people who are going to places like Turkey and Lebanon and Jordan, but it's a crisis for us, and the response has been to shut down borders and very often let people die in the Mediterranean and things like that. And so, in my estimation, like, this is a kind of sanitized form of apostasy. It's you might see that as a bit of a stretch, but I think there's an interesting case to be made, and there's a tragic loss of life, in these instances.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, as you say, I don't find those analogous at all. That that because very bad things happen for one reason doesn't justify a very bad principle in somewhere which is in a totally different field.
That's not my argument, of course, but okay.
Well, I think it is.
No, it's not at all. We can drill down in the argument if you like.
But I think at the end of the day, this is a very significant thing because it affects. It goes to the heart of freedom of religion or belief. Now I know that there are emotional things here, and you can't. Humans are humans, so you can understand if somebody is, say you had a child and that child grew up and said, sorry, Dad, I've decided I'm going to become a humanist or a Christian. You would be very upset.
Right.
And that's naturally sort of natural because for two reasons. One is because you think, does that reflect on me and everything? But you'd also be thinking, you'd be worried for your child as well because of your beliefs.
Right.
And that's all understandable.
Yeah.
But you probably, hopefully, you still love your child.
Right. I mean, I think that's
And so, to me, that the whole idea of rules against apostasy and laws and all of the medieval traditions all came to the same view on this one, I think.
Right.
Is
that almost universal, yeah.
Yeah. Is a real, that's a red line for me, and because it goes to the heart. You can't have freedom of religion and belief if you deny people the freedom to change religion or belief.
Right.
So
but this is where it gets interesting. This is where it gets interesting because basically, I mean, like, what happens with a lot of people who are designated terrorists, and as we discussed, like, in terms of the way in which drones were conducted, particularly under Obama, but under all U.S. presidents from the second term of Bush, if I recall correctly, is that large numbers were not very clearly designated as terrorist threats. They were vaguely understood in that way.
Yeah.
But the analogy I think to be drawn there is that I've kind of lost the thread there for a moment. So what you have is a situation with respect to something like apostasy where someone is designated as, just to make clear, the medieval tradition is building on a statement which is attributed to the Prophet and interpreted in a way that basically says people cannot leave Islam. But in practice, it was basically for political of departure from the community. So
it's a treasonous idea.
It was a kind of treasonous thing, and that's why there are plenty of, not a great deal actually, but there are some examples in Islamic history of kind of atheist writers. And I remember speaking to Patricia Kroner, who's one of my teachers at Princeton, and a very eminent historian of atheism in the Islamic tradition. Very funny. She had very sort of fascinating interests. She's passed now. But she once, remarked to me saying that, well, actually, when you read about atheists in medieval Islam and they're asked, why don't you just go public and say that, you don't believe this stuff? Why do you still go to prayer and things like that? Because they would still participate in prayer and participate as though they were part of Muslim society. And they wouldn't say, she told me, they wouldn't say that, we fear for our lives. They'd say, we fear for being divorced from our wives and not having custody of our children and things like that. Yeah. So I think, there was a qualitative difference between intellectual apostasy versus political sort of like treason and those sorts of things.
Yeah.
And that's where the terrorism analogy is very interesting, because basically under the current world order, you cannot renege on the nation state. And in a sense, nationalism can create certain types of religion. This is an argument which is an old one you're probably familiar with, but the person I'm drawing on is someone called Carlton Hayes. He was an intellectual historian at Columbia University, died in the 60s. And I think that it's not just, bad things happen to people, and therefore that's the point of the analogy. I think it's far more interesting than that, and far more intellectually sort of, arresting in a sense, that, you can engage in violence against someone who is a threat to the nation. And as Nathan Hale, he quotes Nathan Hale, this kind of great soldier who's, I can't remember exactly which war, but he's famous for saying, he was killed in his 20s. My only regret is that I can die for my country only once, right? Which reminded me of a prophetic statement. The Prophet Muhammad apparently said, I think this is a canonical hadith, that, I wish I was killed in battle and then I was brought back to life and killed again in battle and brought back to life and killed again in battle. Meaning I wish I could make the ultimate sacrifice. And so, those analogues are, I think, more than just, coincidences. I think there's something going on there. And that's why, for me, terrorism is this ultimate, this is the threat to our way of life, the way in which this is talked about, right? And it justifies, that ultimate thing which, under normal sort of circumstances is anathema. And that's why I do think that there is an interesting, obviously this is a very short sort of articulation of this, and I understand you strongly disagree with it, but I just thought I'd say that.
Yeah. I mean, yes, yeah. I mean, I can see the thing about the treason and things, and how nationalism can become. If you look at Russia now, Russian nationalism is becoming, although entwined, religion is becoming part of the identity of Russian nationalism. And I can see that, and therefore a betrayal of it, and that's why Putin feels free to assassinate people in London, because they've betrayed the cause, if you like. But we all condemn that.
Yes.
So
we do, but we also stay silent about the deaths of thousands of people in drone strikes by our allies.
Of course, I'm not saying
we're not innocent, but I think the ideological component is very.
We often weigh things very differently and inconsistently, and although
we're human,
the stated intent of terrorist movements, whether they're the jihadis or whether they're the far right or the numerous other groups that come out, is to destroy, our way of life. That's their stated aim. But then what you're talking about is when you're protecting yourself against that, that indiscriminately killing innocent people, and and that is that's a terrible thing to do, and there's a big issue in war. In fact, there's a wonderful film, by the way, I don't know if you saw it, called Iron Sky, about a drone.
Yes, I have watched that.
That is the, it's the it's the class, it's the trolley problem, philosophical problem, but in real life, where you're talking about real people, in that case a child. Do you kill that child or risk that child? And what you would argue, and I think probably correctly, is often those decisions have been taken far too lightly. And but I think they're in a completely different bucket to having the principle that if you leave a religion, then if you given a chance to repent, and then you can be killed for it.
So what's worse? What's worse, having a principle which is more honoured in the breach than the observed, or actually, having a contrary principle which respects, people's rights to life and so on, and literally doing the opposite on a scale which is, far. Yeah.
Oh yeah, but I think that's, you're right. The latter one is much worse, but I'm not talking about that one. I think they're completely different. Just because.
But I think we have to, because basically.
I don't think they're in the same bracket at all.
They're not. But they're certainly not in the same. Yes. Go ahead.
Why don't we, another one where there are all sorts of different decisions. About, take the Uyghurs in China. Terrible suffering on a huge scale. And
Right.
what do we do about that? And
But we're not guilty of perpetrating that,
we're not guilty of doing it.
in the
We may be
West.
guilty about not doing enough about it. Yeah.
Yeah, and there I have to express my sort of begrudging gratitude to the United States, because they're the only people who've ever said anything about it.
I think the UK government has, actually, to be fair.
And the UK
They have.
as well. I mean,
Yeah.
the UK as well. But yeah, I mean, like Muslim countries have been, sort of disgracefully silent about it.
Yes, they have. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's money. Yeah. But yeah. So I mean, there are lots and lots of terrible things, and I think because the Afghan situation, of course, is to the fore at the moment, and
Right,
you have
right.
seen people on social media, the right wing, who begin to identify the Taliban with, or
Right.
their Muslim
Right,
extremism and everything,
Right,
you
right,
know, and for all of the people who are desperately trying to escape are also Muslims
right.
who are being persecuted in Afghanistan.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah.
Everyone's a Muslim in Afghanistan. So
Yeah.
virtually there are some
As you
exceptions.
pointed out, it's in the constitution that the Islam is the state religion, and laws have to be in
Yeah.
conformity with it.
Yeah. No, I'm not saying that's a good thing. It's just that
I know, but I'm just trying to point out that people are saying, oh, the ancien regime in this particular instance that has been replaced by the Taliban was really the savior and the secular sort of like, but that wasn't really secular
it's
in
not.
the sense
It's not
that
a
we
secular.
would.
No, the ancien regime
Yeah.
is certainly not secular. No,
Yeah,
certainly
yeah.
not. So but it illustrates, I think, the fact that these are all separate topics. That the ancien regime was not secular. I would disagree with a lot of the things, and it was also hopelessly corrupt, of course.
Right.
But then you have other issues to do with women's rights and all the other things we all know about,
Right.
and they are separate issues, and
Yeah.
I would and we can talk about women's rights in Islam. That's another discussion. But I think
Right,
in
right,
terms
right.
of freedom of religion and belief,
Right.
the fact that you can enter Islam very easily, but you can't
Right.
it's impossible to exit it without, in some countries, fear of death. In a number of countries, actually, legally, that's still
Right.
the case.
Right. Right.
That's, to me, is extremely problematic.
Right.
And
But again,
it
I
is
mean,
rather unique.
Yeah. Again, what's fascinating for me, and this is something that was commented on by a really great, he's actually a British sort of anthropologist, Talal Asad. You might have heard of him, but he wrote a piece in the 90s. It's an academic journal article. I can share it with you. It's quite short.
Okay, right.
And he basically says, it's fascinating that there is, a great deal of concern expressed about the sort of rights of people like Taslima Nasreen and Salman Rushdie for their sort of freedom of expression and things like that. But the rights of, he was talking at the time about imprisoned sort of mainstream Islamists who were democratic in orientation, in fact, in Egypt's prisons.
Yeah.
Didn't register in
Yeah.
the Western consciousness, and
Yeah.
for me it's fascinating how like these things can simultaneously stay in the mind of people who pride themselves on rationality and these sorts of things, and it kind of reminds me of the fact that we're ultimately sort of really, rationality is a process where you constantly struggle to maintain that sort of norm, and I think the record that
I think one of the problems we have on that is actually we know too much. That we now are, the conditions of people in prison in Egypt, the Muslim activists in prison in Egypt, or in Turkey, and I know Muslim, refugees in this country from Turkey because they're the wrong sort of Muslim, who are under threat, and all of these. We know about all of those things. We know about, the fanatical Hindus in India, and the plight of Muslims who are second-class citizens in some cases, and we know about the plight of Hindus in Pakistan, and and don't even ask about non-religious people in Pakistan. And so we know about. The problem is we know so much. I don't know about you. I sometimes find myself overwhelmed by it because there's so much to be concerned about. And what the only way a human can cope with that is to say, okay, I can't be concerned about everything.
Right.
So let's just focus on the things maybe I can do something about.
Right.
And you can do something about Salman Rushdie because he's, he was symbolic of, he's a British author, and he was, and his books burned in Bradford or wherever it was. That's very close to home, and it's going back quite a long time now. But you can sort of do something about that. And there's a capacity issue. This is unique to our times. Nobody's ever been in this situation before.
Right. I mean, having access to all of this info about so many different types of struggles. But yes, I think, yet at the same time, I think what's interesting for me is that in terms of, what's the ultimate purpose of our interventions? Is it to realize human freedom? Is it to reduce human suffering, etc.? And that lens, the lens that we adopt, will make certain types of struggle worthy and other types of struggle less worthy. I mean, I think I don't want to sort of justify that necessarily, but sometimes, as you say, we end up making choices about what we focus on. And at the moment, because the West is politically, militarily, economically powerful, what matters to the West is really what gets the attention, I think. It makes things very complicated in my estimation when you're looking at things from a different sort of perspective. My perspective is, doesn't make sense to a lot of people in the West. My view, for example, that terrorism is, only important by virtue of securitization, that the number of people killed in terrorism has been dwarfed by perhaps orders of magnitude by the numbers of people killed by American empire in response to terrorism, is something that should make us all more concerned about preventing violent extremism from the Americans rather than from, people who, but the thing is that violence doesn't affect most Europeans. The only type of violence which affects Europeans is the blowback from sort of American interventionism in various Muslim countries or various other countries.
Yes, but that's saying 9/11 was the fault of the Americans and or the fault of the West. That's saying the extension of that is saying that 9/11 was the fault of the West. And I'm afraid I just don't buy that.
I don't think that needs to be understood in that way whatsoever.
That's the terrorist example par excellence, isn't it? And the people who are killing
that's the terrorist example par excellence. But what I'm saying is 9/11. The response to 9/11 should have been proportionate to the perpetrators of 9/11 and not consumed the entire, engulfed Iraq and Afghanistan as entire countries, killed hundreds of thousands of people in the process.
I mean, obviously,
and securitized Muslims in the West and all the rest of it. So, I mean, my point isn't.
I understand what you're saying. Yes, the scale of these things, and obviously some of these things got linked in ways that shouldn't have been linked. Like there was zero link between Iraq and 9/11, of course. And if you ask most Americans now, they still think there is. And and
there's no consequence either. I mean, there's no consequence that hundreds of thousands of Iraqis died for nothing, right?
Yes. I mean, mostly as a result of the civil war that erupted because nobody thought.
But that's what happens when you invade countries, right? You create civil wars, right?
You take the lid off, things. But yes, I mean, I don't think anyone would say that was anything other than a disaster. And I think what we've just seen in Afghanistan is a disaster. And I think when you said that the West is all powerful, I think what we're seeing is the end of it, to some extent. And the worry is that the end of it will mean the people who are celebrating that are the dictators of Putin, Xi,
and Xi, and
and though American may not always been a popular policeman, you don't have a policeman at all. The the bad guys come out to play, and so and I think this is a huge change we're living through, and Europe is showing itself rather impotent, and so it's interesting, and America is no longer, my view, personal view, I'm not speaking for Humanist UK here, is no longer a trusted partner.
I mean, I think the last 4 or 5 years obviously was really put a dent in global confidence in the United States.
Yeah.
And I do think that Russia and China as alternatives are quite terrifying for Muslims. I mean, particularly China, but even Russia, considering what they did to perpetuate the Syrian war. So yeah, I mean, like, from a Muslim perspective, and this is, somewhat provincial, but also potentially sort of like thinking about a quarter of humanity. It's not, it's a trying time, shall we say. I've got it very easy. I live in the UK and it's a stable country for now. But at the same time, I think, these are, so perhaps we can conclude on this point, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on this. Like, religious people very often have a sense of vocation in the face of suffering. At least, I feel that, okay, well, there's so much terrible stuff going on in the world. I have a responsibility as someone who basically on a global measure, I live in luxury, right? Most of us in the West do. And I have some kind of role to play there, and I feel duty bound before God, as I would believe it, to play that role. And I wonder sort of how you think there might be synergies between sort of people of religion, people of secularity, Muslims in particular, for example, and secular people.
Well, I suppose the drive in practice is very similar, because I would say that human rights are universal, and that applies to suffering Muslims who've suffered from a drone attack as much as it applies to anybody else, and I think you've seen the reaction publicly and in all the vox pops and on social media to what's going on in Afghanistan. People's hearts go out to the people affected. There's an emotional reaction, and it's interesting seeing some of the speeches in the House of Commons, which is the first time I've seen it recently behave in a decent way, instead of a non-partisan way. And I don't know if you saw the speech, which
unfortunately I've not been, well, fortunately or unfortunately I've not been
following. There's a very good speech by Tom Tugendhat, who's a Tory MP, who served in Afghanistan. And he was talking. He
studied Islamic theology, incidentally. He's a very interesting character.
Yeah.
Yes.
And and he talked about the lasting images, and obviously he's dreadfully upset and felt very, very emotional about it, because he said, people have died, and his lasting. Said, I just want to leave you with this, and it was a story of when they were somewhere in Afghanistan, and there was a man walking towards them carrying a child, and he said, I don't know this man's name, I never knew his name, and he was just begging us to help, and the child he was carrying was dead, and he arrived at their fire base, as he called it, and asked for their help, and of course he said they could do nothing. The child had already died. And he said that's his takeaway, was a feeling powerlessness, and
I wish our states had this kind of introspection before they went in.
But should they? That would have been the last 20 years. So
sorry, your sound cut out. My internet.
Sorry, you can argue about that. I mean, the Taliban would have been in power for the last 20 years, and there wouldn't have been any women. And
I think there could have been other ways in which we could have, basically created pressure, international pressure from multiple quarters. I mean, there was a huge amount of sympathy after 9/11 for the United States. And the Taliban was trying to buy some time, but the way in which, if you have a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. And with the U.S. military-industrial complex, it's like they're itching to go to war, and you're going to cause Biden in this terribly sort of like insensitive way, in my estimation, sort of talks about US deaths without giving any sort of reference to the fact that probably, something like 100,000 not Taliban, Afghanis have been killed in the process of the last 20 years.
And most of the soldiers killed were Afghan soldiers, and I think that was one of the things that came up in this parliamentary debate. That people were furious that he talked as if everyone had just run away and nobody done anything, and ignored the fact that all those Afghans had died, and
right.
Yeah, so there's all sorts of stuff that's wrong. That's
yeah.
a different. But I think go back to your main point about, that people care because they're seeing fellow humans suffering, and that's what motivates people to do. Now, you can be motivated by, and I know other people. I know Christians who are motivated to do wonderful things by their faith, and a lot of Muslims are motivated by it, and that but I think other people are, there's all sorts of people motivated in all sorts of ways, because at the end of the day, you're motivated by your sense of public duty, if you like, and care.
Right.
How do you decide between right and wrong? Well, I would say it's two things. It's your rational thinking, but it's also your empathy, and empathy, because we're fellow humans, and when you see suffering, you want to alleviate it.
Right. I mean, I hope that we can those are things which one would hope would be universal, and things which we can try to cultivate. And I think it's extremely important. I mean, this is why I always enjoy speaking with you, Jeremy, on these sorts of themes, because it's very important for us to cultivate that understanding across these various sort of points of disagreement, but yet it's a bit of a cliche, but what unites us in so many ways is greater than what divides us.
True.
So I look forward to thank you so much for really spending a good deal of time with me. I also would like to thank the viewers and the people who put in questions. I mean, there were a couple of other questions, but I feel that we've gone a bit too long, and they were, in my estimation, addressed earlier on in the conversation. So a chap named Joe Baz was asking a question. Please do look at the recording later. But I'd really like to thank you first, Jeremy, for sort of giving me an hour and 42 minutes of your time. It's really been illuminating and eye-opening and mind-broadening in my estimation. So I look forward to future opportunities. I'm sure we will have more of these, and we can coordinate when might be a good time for you as well.
Yeah, no, thank you. And as always, talking to you, Usaama, it's stimulating, challenging, and makes you think.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Okay. And I look forward to seeing our viewers in a week's time. Jeremy, if you'd like, you can stick around a little after the recording, but I'm just going to play an outro, and I'll see you shortly. Take care. Bye-bye.